Hello and welcome to this BCS IT Leaders Forum, Why You Shouldn't Move to the Cloud. My name is John Edwards and I'm delighted to introduce our speakers this afternoon. All five are from the Leeds consultancy Perform Partners. Paul Rhodes, Rob Smith and Sean Walsh founded the consultancy 3 years ago and have enlisted the help of two colleagues, Dan Wilson and Damien Hager, to share their personal experience of cloud migration with a focus on how to do it well by understanding how it can go badly wrong. So we will be looking at gaining a proper grasp of organizational drivers to migrate to the cloud, the features of good design and of course of bad design, how to avoid undue complexity in deployment, and of course never forgetting the human element in this sort of change. We'll have a Q&A session after the presentations, so do please jot down your questions into the chat function in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we will deal with as many as we have time for before we close at 5 o'clock. So I'll now hand over to our speakers, and our first speaker, Rob Smith. Welcome.
Thank you very much, John. Good afternoon and welcome everybody. A good introduction there from John and a couple of things I'd like to run through myself before we jump into the presentation. So as John introduced, my name is Rob Smith. I am one of the founding partners of Perform Partners. Myself and the team behind this afternoon's presentation are extremely excited to be presenting to you today. We'd obviously like to be there in person. However, we know there's an incredible amount of attendees that have joined us this afternoon. We know some of which wouldn't have been able to join us in the room. So we recognise there's an advantage to these type of events that seems to become commonplace. I wanted to thank you all for your time this afternoon. As John mentioned, we've got a section right at the back for Q&A, so please do capture questions as we trot along, and the whole panel will come together and hope to answer those. Anything that we run out of time on, we'll take away and come back to you. So I wanted to thank you all for your time. I genuinely hope you find it useful, insightful, but more so really interesting. So as you can see on screen, these are the key people that John introduced earlier from the organisation. We've got Paul Rhodes and Sean Morse, the other co-founders, Damien Hager and Dan Wilson. I'll be doing the introduction, the informed decision-making section. Paul's going to look at misconceptions and considerations. Damien will take us on, is cloud your destination? And Dan will look at learnings from a cloud migration. And then Sean will wrap us up with migrating your people to the cloud. Everyone this afternoon who's in front of you has been involved in some aspect of a cloud migration with Perform Partners. In a short space of time, we've learned an incredible amount and experienced an incredible amount, both with industry-leading experts and organisations, as well as customers that we serve today in that space. We've carved up the presentation this afternoon so the key people with the best experience can give you their insight into the experiences that we've had, and hopefully present to you this afternoon why you shouldn't move to the cloud. Before we go into the presentation, I just wanted to give you an important overview of who Perform Partners are. We were established over 3 years ago, starting with myself, Paul and Sean, and then fast forward to today, and we are just short of 30 highly skilled, experienced individuals across a number of skills and capability. Perform Partners was founded to disrupt an already busy marketplace and bring our unique service operations to the market. We are program leadership experts. we don't badge ourselves as agile specialists or waterfall traditionalists. We listen with great pride to our customers, understand where they're trying to get to, what their challenge is, and apply the right delivery mechanisms and process and methodologies to get there. Understanding our customers' why, and those of you that have read and listened to Simon Sinek, that may resonate, and we apply the right fit team and approach to deliver the outcomes of the customer. I'm proud to say in a short space of time, as you can see on screen, we've managed to accredit ourselves with a number of key accreditations from AWS partner status, suppliers on government frameworks, ISO and Cyber Essentials, all of which strengthen our strategy in the marketplace and into 2022. We have and continue to operate in fast-paced organizations and sectors. Just over 7 months ago, we were shortlisted for Cloud Project of the Year. Unfortunately, it was an online virtual event, but in modern day terms, it was around about 800 people in a facility over in Manchester. It was for Digital City Awards, and we were up against one of the UK's leading management consultants, according to the Financial Times. For us, it was a real David and Goliath moment. It was also our very first event, and it continues to fill me with great pride and passion that on that evening we won that award. We believe we are one of the most competitive consultancies in the market sector in the cloud space, and we're currently operating across financial, insurance, real money gaming, and government sectors. So now into the presentation. Our routine will be the speaker will be on camera, everyone else will be on mute. So I'm pleased to introduce one of the other founders, Paul Rose.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, moving swiftly on. So I'm going to talk to you about the misconceptions that people face around migrating or adopting a cloud strategy, and what considerations you should make or accept for informed decisioning. Okay, so 5 misconceptions. There's probably many more, but these are the main ones that we've come across over the last 2-3 years in migrating cloud for our customers, or just establishing brand new cloud environments for customers. So in terms of migration, so it's not just technical change, and it shouldn't just fall on IT to manage and push this transformation through. Cloud affects the whole organization. So when choosing to migrate to the cloud, the whole company from top down, CEO down, needs to be behind that, because it doesn't just change your IT infrastructure, it fundamentally changes the way you operate and run your IT, which then dovetails back to how you operate and run your finances, your IT operations, your product management, and other areas to support. So it gives you the business agility, but you need to change your ways of working across the piece to support that. Second, I've got it's cheaper to be and migrate to the cloud. It's not always the case. So again, you would consider, or misconception is, it is cheaper. It's not cheaper if you have a stable infrastructure, and you're comfortable with that cost. You need to consider the cost of making the changes. Again, I mentioned it's not just an IT change, it's a cross-company change. So you need to have a very thorough look at the business case in terms of what the costs are to change, and actually what the costs are to operate. If you don't have things like spiky demand, or you've got a reasonably consistent customer base and the customer demand through your online spaces, then it may not be the best thing for you to do in terms of cost. but it's a misconception that it's cheaper often. Thirdly, everyone is moving to the cloud, just because it's probably an obvious statement, but consider the why first. I mean, Rob mentioned our obsession with why earlier, but you should always consider that. You should say, well, actually, what is it right fit? Is it the right thing for our business to do? And does it fit with our strategy before jumping in with both feet? It has to be beneficial, obviously. You've got your customers and your operation to consider, but it has to be beneficial all around. Just like any other major transformation change, you would business case it and analyze whether or not it's the right thing to do. Cloud provides disaster recovery. So cloud doesn't necessarily provide disaster recovery. You need to consider that as a strategy if you adopt cloud. Cloud does provide resiliency. It sits within geographical regions, which each of those geographical regions has availability zones which provide ultimately the resiliency, but it doesn't necessarily provide disaster recovery. So you always need to make sure you have a plan for that. It may be another region if regulatory jurisdictions allow that to back off as your DR, or it could be still on-prem. You could remain with some on-prem capability for your disaster recovery. But again, it's part of your architectural decision before moving or migrating to the cloud. It's basically it's the same with any DR question. You've got to ask yourselves what you can live with and what you can't, and adjust your DR plan to match. And finally, we've seen this before. It's not limitless. So an example of where we did a very, very large cloud migration, but the IP range that we were planning to migrate was quite large, and we didn't know until we actually did it that actually the cloud has service limits, so they couldn't accept all the IPs that we wanted to migrate. So we had to adjust and adapt to that so that we could put a plan together. So we're able to migrate the right amount of IPs for that cloud environment. But it's just an example of where you think you can do anything in that space. There are certain restrictions. Similar would be if you have a hybrid version of a cloud to some degree, and then it backs off to some on-prem, whether that's a jurisdictional problem that you've got to keep a database on premise. You need to have a fully architected networking piece done as well to make sure that you can benefit from the speed the cloud gives. It's only as fast as your biggest pipe in and out. So it's not limitless. It's good, but it's not limitless. So it's just to consider that. Next slide. Okay, I mentioned it, I touched on it earlier, regulatory jurisdictions. So we've worked with a few companies where this has really been important. So it's the question again, is where does your data go? Where does it need to be stored? Are you operating under a regulator that has strict rules and laws? Obviously, there's PCI and other things. Can you, for example, we're working with a customer at the moment that is a public sector customer, and the data cannot leave the UK, so that they have to consider the cloud is the option, but their consideration has to be within a region that sits in the UK. It's just an example of where you need to be crystal clear on what you can and can't do and where that can be. So in other customers, we've needed EU, rest of the world, UK coverage, which from an apps perspective is fine, but the data had to reside in Europe for some part of the data, and UK for others, depending on which regulatory environment they're operating under. So again, it's part of that upfront decision, understanding your area in terms of your regulation and what your regulator, and speak to your regulator in terms of what you're allowed to do, what you can't do, because cloud changes so fast, regulators often don't keep up. Or are a bit slower to change. So in some instances we've gone through with some customers, they've talked openly to their regulator and asked the questions, and you don't always have the answers, but over time they will probably change policy. Depends on what industry you're working in. But so that's moves me swiftly on to the next point of consideration. That's why up front you need to, if you have a compliance teams in your business, you need to engage them very early on in this process, so that all the legalities and regulatory issues are fully understood before you make any decision on which cloud, where, how, and how that is all architected together. So third consideration is target operating models. So I mentioned on the previous slide about this change not just being IT, it's a whole business. So you shouldn't underestimate the organizational changes required to support a well migrated cloud, because you need to, one of your main aims would be to improve your business agility. So if you move from A to B and just put things in, lifted and shifted into a cloud without thinking about that organization and the ways of working, you're effectively not changing. You're not taking any of the benefits that cloud can give you. It needs to be consideration on how you upskill your workforce, how they change, how you manage your product management and development changes, how you market things, what roles HR plays in terms of you may be having job role changes. There'll be upskill and training pieces. So it's not just IT. In finance, for example, you can potentially have a lot more visibility on your infrastructure spend. Again, there will probably be training required because there are tools in place that the cloud can give real-time cost updates to finance, but it's then knowing what to do with that and where to proportion it off. So it's a much wider. I can't reiterate that enough. It's much wider than just IT. So architectural. So I won't dwell on this one too long because we've got two of my colleagues will be talking a bit more in depth about the technical side, the aspects of the cloud. So there are multiple solutions that you can adopt. There are obviously a full cloud. You could decide to full cloud migration. You could decide to, again, due to regulatory constraints, you might have to keep databases. You might have to keep certain things, certain transactions on premise or in a certain jurisdiction. You could have multiple clouds, so you could use different vendors of cloud, depending on, again, you choose depending on what your infrastructure stack's based on, might lead you to one provider over another naturally. You could decide to develop a private cloud. Again, you'd need to understand what skill sets required to do that. Or you could that's pretty much I think I've covered them all. So but that's, again, it's knowing what you're getting into before you make the leap. So finally, financial. So this is an interesting area because this does change quite a lot to what a traditional finance team can do. So it's the amount of, it's almost like an eye opener moment for finance teams when they see what power they can have in terms of the availability of online real-time reporting from cloud spend. So things like it can enable finance teams to understand true costs of products, so true costs of infrastructure. So right down to you can measure what a product costs. Again, from a business case, it gives you greater insight into actually would you do it or not. So it also improves the amount of data in real time, which subsequently informs spending decisions. So, for example, we've had customers in the past where they've looked at their environment, and actually because they see the spend on the environment on an evening, let's say, are running, but there's no services running, so but still spending money. You can switch those things off. So you can put some change process in place that you can turn off service. It's almost on demand when you need it, which again saves you money because you pay for what you use. So again, finance can also notice where some servers are not optimized in the correct way. And again, it's all about using data to inform better decisions and inform being more proactive in terms of how you spend money in the cloud and elsewhere. That's me covered off for those two areas. I'll be handing back to Rob to wrap up this section. Rob?
Thanks, Paul. Okay, so to summarise, from the various misconceptions and considerations that we as Perform partners have experienced, there's essentially 4 key aspects that we believe any organisation needs to consider. Customers, you don't need me to tell you that we should be putting customers front and centre. So how would a cloud migration improve your customer experience? Costs, which Paul has just touched on, so from business case to product development. Does your organisation know the full cost in readiness for a cloud migration? People and organisation, in our experience, often overlooked and under-considered. How does moving to the cloud impact on your people and therefore your organisation? And then finally, technology. Possibly one of the biggest misconceptions that we found as the initial key drivers of migrating to the cloud. But I'll let one of my colleagues cover the technology piece. So without further ado and stealing anyone's thunder, I'm pleased to hand over to Damien Haggett.
Thanks, Rob. Hello, everyone. My name is Damien Haggett, and I am lead architect at Perform Partners. Now, just take a look at this picture that you see in front of you. In the background, you can see a large office building with a nice painting on it. That we have an office in that building, and in the foreground is Leeds train station. Now, when you're planning a journey to Leeds by train, you wouldn't say that the train station was your destination. You'd say that Leeds is your destination. And yet, when people are talking about cloud migration, they have a tendency to focus on the cloud as being that destination. And so the topic of this conversation is actually, is cloud your destination? Next slide, please. So what I'm going to be covering in this presentation, first of all, what do we mean by cloud? Let's be clear about that. Secondly, what routes can you take in your organization cloud migration, depending upon what it is that you're wanting to migrate? What part do business capabilities play in helping you to migrate and operationalize that migration? And then finally, does that really mean that the operating model is the new destination? Next slide, please. So first of all, what do we mean by cloud? This is an overloaded term, so it is very useful to get this right from the beginning. What I've drawn here is essentially the 6 different hosting models that are typical for an organization. An application can be hosted in one of these 6. The first 3 are what we call bricks and mortar. Essentially, they are physically located away from the cloud. They are not in the cloud. Whereas the last 3 are. Let me go through those. So a traditional on-premise. Traditional on-premise is where technology is deployed, your applications are deployed on premises to your organization, to your premises, and therefore you're responsible for the premises and the network and storage, the physical servers. You're also responsible for the virtualization, the operating system, the database, the application, the data. You are responsible as an organization for the whole stack. If you are co-located, that means that the premises are shared with another organization, but you may have network and storage of your own in those premises, and everything else is yours. If it is hosted, then the physical servers that are in that other building will be managed by somebody else. You will be managing the virtualization and everything else. So those are the bricks and mortar permutations. The cloud, the first one is infrastructure as a service. This is where a company such as Google or Microsoft, they provide the virtualization as well. You will have to provide the operating system, the database and applications, but this is the first step into cloud. Platform as a service is where an organization such as Microsoft with Azure or Amazon Web Services provides you with what they call platform services, which are services which take the load away from you in terms of the operating model, the operating system and the databases. And then there's finally software as a service. Software as a service is Microsoft Office 365. You log into your email and you don't even have to think about where that application is being hosted. You know that you can access it through your browser, and all you need to be concerned about as an organization is your data. So those are the 6 different hosting models. Next slide, please. The second question is really, what kind of application do you need to migrate? Again, when people say we're migrating to the cloud, it can often be overloaded. What are they migrating? There is essentially 2 different types of things that you could be migrating. One is an application that you have built. So for example, if you're a software company or you are a large organization that has an internal software development function, then it may be that you're migrating that application or one of your line of business applications that you've developed yourself. Alternatively, you may be wishing to migrate an application that you've bought. This may be an ERP system, or it may be a document management system, a system that you've bought that you have hosted either as traditional on-premise, co-hosted, as co-located or hosted, so on bricks and mortar. But it's essentially you have bought that application and you've installed it in your servers. So those are the 2 different types of applications that could be migrated. Next slide, please. Finally, what are the routes to migration? So to make sure that we are all on the same page here, if you are choosing to migrate an application that you've built, there are fundamentally 2 different choices there. You're either doing a lift and shift to infrastructure as a service. What that really means is that you're taking, if you have built the application, you are taking the code and essentially the servers that it has been built on, and you're installing it into the cloud. You are simply shifting the code. You're not doing anything to it. The alternative is to migrate to platform as a service for your built application. And when you do that, what you're really doing is you may be keeping the same application but changing the underlying technology, or you may actually be changing the application as well at the same time and taking advantage of the services, the platform services that cloud can offer you. This is where you often see applications being transformed from a monolithic application, where it is the traditional web app and database tiers, into something like a microservices architecture. If this is happening, this is a significant architectural change. Coming back to what Paul was talking about, that's a massive architectural change to an application. So by moving a built application to the cloud and changing its underlying architecture, significant impact. Alternatively, if you have bought your application and you are wishing to move it on from, as it is showing here, traditional on-premise, co-location or hosted, your choices are essentially infrastructure as a service, which is similar to the built process, which is you're doing a lift and shift. So for example, if let's say you have an old instance of SharePoint hosted on your servers, and let's say the database that SharePoint is hosted on is going out of support. Therefore, you may not be compliant with certain regulations. You need to resolve that. It may be possible that you can migrate SharePoint into infrastructure as a service rather than moving everything into SharePoint Online. You might actually choose to do that instead in order to minimize the disruption to your existing business processes and minimize the risk to the project delivery and operations. So infrastructure as a service is a way of doing a lift and shift of your existing built application, your bought applications. And then finally, there's the choice of going to software as a service. So following on from that SharePoint instance, you may say, okay, we've got a SharePoint instance that we're currently hosting, but we want to move to SharePoint Online. You're essentially moving to software as a service because SharePoint is essentially you are only in control of the data, and that whilst on the face of it might seem a fairly trivial task, it's not, as we'll explore in a second. Next slide, please. So what I've just done is I've just made sure that we're all on the same page about what is cloud, what kind of applications can we migrate, and how can you migrate those applications? What is the destination station, so to speak, for those applications? In order to do a migration, you will need business capabilities. The most important business capability, from my experience, the one that you absolutely must have is project delivery. Because what you're doing is you are bringing together a set of resources to work on a project that can be quite complex. And that requires the governance and the coordination that project delivery capabilities bring. If you have built your application, you will need product development. If you haven't, you may still need some form of development expertise, depending upon the nature of the software as a service application that you may be migrating to, if you have bought your application. And then there's platform operations. Platform operations is traditionally thought of in terms of the infrastructure people. These are the three main business capabilities that you'll need, but you will need to focus on those new specialized skills. They're not just new to the organization, but they will be specialized because new technologies, as Paul was just saying, technology is moving at such a rate that the skills that are required by the specialists who will be conducting the migration they will not necessarily have if they have been working in only an on-premise organization. That is a crucial element to a cloud migration, having the right people with the right skills. Secondly, there's also the new processes. When you migrate to cloud, there is a new emphasis on security, where previously with traditional on-premise, you may have something of a strong wall around, a strong security wall around your installation. When you move to cloud, that puts a new strain on your security operations. And particularly, as Paul was saying about being able to switch on and switch off services, if you have services running 24/7, then you may need new processes for doing security operations 24/7. And finally, you'll need new tools. There is so many new tools required for managing cloud migrations and managing operationally the applications that are then hosted in the cloud. Our experience of these capabilities is that the more mature those capabilities and the better planned that you are for having those capabilities ready for a project, the more likely you are to succeed, the less risk that you have in both delivery and operations. Next slide, please. So let me go into that a little bit further. The capabilities for migration and our experience of this. Now, Paul did mention DevOps, and DevOps can be a very overloaded term. the best way of looking at this is to actually suggest that you need to be DevOps-y. In other words, you need to take on the principles of DevOps in order to succeed. Reduce organizational silos. This is vital. I cannot overemphasize how important it is to reduce the organizational silos, to improve the communication between teams, functions, individuals. When it comes to a complex delivery, such as migrating to the cloud, you need everybody to have the right tools, the right communication paths, the reduced organizational silos. It's so important. You need to accept failure as normal. Now, in a life cycle where you're perhaps doing releases every 3 months, and perhaps in a regulated environment, that can be a difficult pill to swallow. But if you take it in conjunction with the third aspect, which is implement gradual change, then you are reducing the risk of each of those changes. And if you accept failure as normal, what you're doing is you're preparing for that failure. You're anticipating the failure and therefore making the processes, the deployment processes and the operational processes more robust by anticipating failure. You need to leverage automation. This again is one of the accelerators that I've seen succeed with projects. Automation isn't about robotic process automation. This is about making sure that the deployment processes for infrastructure and for applications are automated. Traditionally, applications have been deployed in a manual way. That in a cloud environment is not scalable. It is not scalable because when you are needing scale within cloud, you need the cloud environment to be able to respond automatically to scale to your needs. Automation is part of that. And finally, measuring everything. Now, measuring everything is something that we should be doing anyway within the business. This is why you have measuring your success at the highest level, whether you're being successful in your business goals, in your strategy. It applies also at the technology level as well. You need to be measuring everything, because if you don't measure everything, how will you know that you've succeeded? How will you know that you've improved by migrating to the cloud? How will you demonstrate return on investment? Consider the wider organization. So again, coming back to what Paul was saying, the wider organization is impacted. I've called out here one function, as Paul was talking about, finance. And one of the things we've seen before is the shift from a predictable capital expenditure on infrastructure and on licenses is suddenly shifting to an unpredictable OPEX for infrastructure, because suddenly you're able to manage the costs of your servers and the scale that it needs to go to. Also, you need to consider the wider organization in terms of the impacts that may be overlooked, such as moving to a third-party identity provider or multi-factor authentication, where you currently log in, for example, with your Active Directory, you'll log in with your credentials and your username and password. Moving to a cloud environment may mean that you need a new identity provider, which means that you'll be reusing credentials potentially between different applications. And multi-factor authentication is something that's, again, very important if you're moving to the cloud. Multi-factor authentication is a way of saying it's not just about username and password to identify somebody, it's an additional form of authentication. Laying the groundwork for the capability to improve. So it's one of the worst projects that I've experienced has been where the organization threw individuals at a project and didn't anticipate the need for them to skill up, the need for them to refine their skills, improve processes, and permit the teams the time to improve those processes, become efficient. The capabilities and the maturity lead to better quality and value. and they lower delivery and architecture risks. If you have a capability which is immature, then they're far more likely to not be aware of the risks of making key design decisions. It only happens if maturity pathways exist, and this is about having a suitable culture and leadership that's capability focused. Again, the best experience I've had in a project, the most successful project I've been involved in, is where the leadership at the CTO level was fully engaged in the project, was sponsoring it, was keen to oversee what was going on, understand the decisions that were being made on their behalf, but would focus on the capabilities that were being built, not just during project delivery, but for operationally. And finally, the last two, empowering decision makers at the right level and providing the governance through delegated authority. If decision makers at the coalface aren't empowered to make the decisions they need to, then you're inevitably going to create bottlenecks at the higher levels. This can have significant impacts on time scales and also the quality of the decisions, because the people who have the most information are the people who are doing the day-to-day work, making the delivery a success. Next slide, please. So we've been talking about what is the cloud. We've been talking about the types of applications that you've been migrating. And we've been talking about the capabilities that you need to migrate apps. But improving capabilities across the organization, not just project delivery and IT operations. It's about the wider organization. Capabilities need governance and assurance, and the leadership and culture are vital to that. Again, coming back to the organizational silos, breaking down those silos, stopping people feeling insular, and make it a joint enterprise. And automation and measurement, providing feedback on improvement. This is, again, about those small changes, incremental changes. Are we improving it? Are we improving it? Yes, keep going. Are we not improving it? Where are we going wrong? If it's an incremental change, then the impact on the service that you're providing is reduced. These are all influenced by business and IT strategy. And again, this is the best experiences I've had in a project. The most successful projects have been those that have had a clear business and IT strategy, where cloud is part of that strategy. The least successful projects are where cloud is almost a tick box exercise, something that is seen as an infrastructure problem and not an organization problem. And this is why I asked that question: is a new operating model the real destination? Next slide, please. So let's take all those components together. We've been talking about, at the bottom there, we've been talking about capabilities. Capabilities so vital to the migration. Going clockwise, we see organization design. Again, reducing the organizational silos. Leadership and culture, absolutely vital that the leaders are sponsoring this. They delegate decision-making appropriately. The governance to make sure the decision-making and the direction of the projects are going in the right direction. The management tools and automation to make sure that the efficiencies that cloud can provide you, you are making the best of those efficiencies through automation. And measurement improvement to make sure that you know what's going on. These are all components of a digital and traditional service portfolio. Consider the fact that if you have on-premise only applications at the moment, you have a traditional service portfolio. As soon as you migrate one of those applications to the cloud, but the remaining are still on-prem, you suddenly have a more diverse portfolio. You are now digital and traditional service portfolio. This expands the capabilities that you need, the skills, the tool sets. It all requires technology roadmaps, an IT strategy and business strategy. This is operating model. Your migration is so important. To get this right, it has to have the business strategy right. Next slide, please. So, in summary, what is the destination? Coming back to the Leeds train station analogy. When you're traveling by train, the train station isn't the destination, and neither is cloud. Cloud is just a station, and the capabilities help you get to that station. The real destination is a new operating model for the organization, and capabilities are part of that model, and the technology, which is cloud, are part of that capability. I strongly advise you to consider planning an operating model before migration. If you want a successful cloud migration, that is how to achieve it. Thank you. And I am now handing over to Dan. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Damien. Hello, everyone. I'm Dan. I'm a technical lead here at Perform. Firstly, thank you very much for coming along today, and also for humouring me while I dance around the somewhat provocative title that we've given to this session, Why You Shouldn't Migrate to the Cloud. I've spent the last few years on assignment to cloud migration projects. So rather than convincing you that you shouldn't do it, I thought it would be more useful if I shared a few ideas on some of the more practical things that you should consider before you start out on that journey. My current assignment is with an enterprise AWS migration, where I'm part of the infrastructure team. So we're providing the foundations for the organization's product teams to use AWS. So creating accounts, providing a safe landing zone with the appropriate security and access controls, and various networking and other services for those product teams to use. Next slide, please. So we're going to have a look at the human side of a cloud migration, specifically your engineering teams and some of the practices that I think they will need to adopt when operating in this new environment. And then there's a couple of specific technology choices that are best made in advance too. So let's start with the engineers. Next slide, please. So how do we migrate our IT systems to the cloud, making such a significant change in the technology that we use and bring everyone along with us, bearing in mind that your existing engineering staff might not have had any exposure whatsoever to cloud technologies? The first question really is, are they willing to make the transition? I've found that it's usually met with great enthusiasm for the opportunity to learn about new technology, but it's not for everyone. We have come across engineers who feel like this is an unnecessary change, that things are just fine the way they are, and who don't really want to participate in the process. Sean is going to go into a bit more detail later about how we've dealt with these kinds of situations. But for the most part, we've seen engineers make that leap from old school tech to working in the cloud with great success. A few core skills that I think engineers need to have or to develop are, firstly, a proficiency in the use of version control systems. That's almost always Git these days. Also, being able to write software or scripts to automate processes and run reporting. Python is a really popular language for this. And the last point here is being able to use code to manage cloud resources rather than manually using the standard management consoles. And we'll dig into this further in a moment. The keys to getting the transition right seem to be, firstly, that openness to learning new stuff, but with no time pressure attached, no deadline for a big service cutover, for example. A staged approach with regular small wins as you migrate each bit of functionality is a great way to instill confidence in engineers who are doing this for the first time. I found that having just a couple more experienced engineers in each team is a really effective way to share knowledge, and it also gives the rest of the team confidence that they've got some backup when they need it. Now, it might be tempting to accelerate your cloud migration with lots of temporary staff, but of course, having a squad full of contractors doing all the interesting project work and leaving it to the perms to support afterwards just isn't going to work. I think careful targeting of external resources can be really useful, but try and keep in mind one of the pillars of DevOps, which is you build it, you run it. Next slide, please. So I feel like this could be the most contentious choice you'll need to make, Windows or Mac laptops. I've used both extensively and I do have a preference, but I've tried to be as objective as possible here and not a smug Mac user like you might remember from this Apple advert. Some of the tooling we use in DevOps workflows works just fine on Windows, sometimes with rough edges. But if you're an exclusively Windows shop and everyone is only using tools that work on Windows, you can get by, and quite comfortably too if you're targeting just the Azure platform. But Windows support isn't universal across the ecosystem, and you will find some software and tools that simply don't work on Windows. In a mixed environment, where you've got Unix users and Windows users, you might find those using Windows are at somewhat of a disadvantage because of this. Now, Microsoft have really embraced the idea of DevOps. You just have to look at the efforts they've gone to with the Windows subsystem for Linux, which allows you to run Linux software on Windows, basically, to see evidence of their commitment. VS Code, TypeScript, PowerShell, these are some other examples of great software they've created in this space. And there are some exciting developments ahead too with WSL-G, which will bring full integration of the Linux apps with the Windows GUI. So I'm convinced Windows is heading in the right direction. All of that said, Unix platforms do still seem to offer the widest support and lowest friction for DevOps workflows at the moment. And I've found a definite preference amongst engineers for using Unix. We've had really good experienced candidates who have interviewed and accepted offers only to drop out when faced with the prospect of using a Windows machine. So at this point in time, I think it is still worth asking that question about whether or not your IT department could support Mac or Linux desktop users if they needed to. And just a final word of advice on this topic is that every step of your pipeline, so that's the chain of tools responsible for getting things from code all the way to functioning cloud resources, all of that really should be executable from an engineer's laptop as well as your CI/CD platform. It's a really important fallback to be able to bootstrap a new environment, for example, or when you've got issues with your usual deployment platform. So that's another reason why this particular technology choice is really important to get right before you get started. So let's go back to one of those practices I think your engineering team would need to embrace, and that's infrastructure as code. So next slide, please. By now, you might have already heard of the term. Here's the Google search trends over the last decade for Amazon Web Services and Terraform, which is pretty much the market leader in infrastructure as coding at the moment. And this shows it surging in popularity over the last 5 years or so as adoption of the public cloud has also picked up. And this is no surprise really, because as businesses have moved away from using physical infrastructure in favor of virtual equivalents in the cloud, they've also gained access to very comprehensive provisioning APIs. And of course, that opens the door to automating the process of creating that infrastructure. So next slide, please. So how does infrastructure as code work? Simply put, we write some code defining what and sometimes how infrastructure should be created and what configuration to apply to it. That's then fed into our infrastructure as code software or service, which will look at what's currently deployed, and it might keep an internal record of this in a state database somewhere. And it'll then make create, update, or delete operations against the appropriate provisioning API to make a bunch of resources exactly as their code specified. As illustrated here, we're also able to deploy multiple stacks or copies of that same infrastructure. This is an iterative process. Our requirements will change over time. So we'll update the code and we'll run this process of comparison of the code and the actual deployed infrastructure on a regular basis. And we'll probably run it regularly anyway, even if our code hasn't changed, because the deployed resources might have experienced drift away from the desired configuration due to manual changes having been made perhaps. But why would we bother writing yet more code in what's probably a new language for your team? Next slide, please. Of course, by automating something, we reap the usual benefits. Firstly, of being able to repeat the process over and over and get the same result each time. For example, when we're deploying multiple stacks to each of our environments, staging and production, let's say, it's essential to know that they're all built and wired up in the same way. And secondly, efficiency. We're able to create all these resources much more quickly than a human could do so manually. And those humans are, of course, much happier now. They don't have to perform all those repetitive tasks anymore. Because we check this code into version control, we have a record of all changes made to that code. And if at any point we want to roll back to how the infrastructure was previously, we can do so easily and with confidence that it's going to be the same as it was before. The code also gives us a record of exactly what our infrastructure consists of. It's the ultimate form of documentation, really. And this greatly reduces the risk of gaps in knowledge when engineers inevitably move on. And there are some security benefits too, which can come from analysis of the code before deployment to ensure that it's not going to do anything daft. We're then able to prevent some forms of non-compliance before they actually happen, rather than reacting to a breach of compliance, which is a definite win. So, what choice of tools do we have to support this practice? Let's have a quick look at some of the options. Next slide, please. So the native tools here from each of the big cloud platforms are firstly CloudFormation, which might seem like the obvious choice if you're using AWS, but it does have a bit of a reputation for being more fiddly to use than some of the alternatives. Azure Resource Manager is well worth a look if you're targeting only Azure. This had an update last year, which got a good reception. And GCP has Deployment Manager. I don't have any experience in using this one, but having read up on it, it's mostly positive too. All of these native solutions are effectively free, thrown in as part of the service, and they definitely should be considered if you're considering migrating to one of these platforms. There are some platform agnostic options you should look at too, though. First and most definitely foremost is HashiCorp's Terraform. If you've had any exposure to cloud technologies, you've probably heard of it already. We'll come back to it in a moment. And next is Pulumi. It's a SaaS product, not open source. I think it's worth investigating because it seems to get rave reviews from developers. It allows them to write infrastructure definitions in a selection of mainstream programming languages that they may already be familiar with. And then there's Ansible. It's quite a popular tool in the network infrastructure space and also as a more traditional configuration management tool. Now, just before we continue, it's worth mentioning that even though these three are platform agnostic technologies, this doesn't imply that the actual code you write will be portable across cloud platforms. So the Terraform code you write for AWS, for example, is going to be very tightly coupled to the AWS resource model. And that's going to be quite different from the Terraform code that you would write for Azure. So generally speaking, if you need to deploy to two different cloud providers, you're still going to need to write approximately double the number of lines of code. So let's return to Terraform, which is quite a popular choice, but it's worth understanding in a bit more detail before you follow the crowd. At its core, Terraform is an open source command line utility that gives you quite a powerful, low-level control over your deployments. You write your infrastructure definitions in something called HashiCorp Configuration Language, or HCL. It's quite a clean, declarative language, as you can see from this little snippet here, but it is unique to Terraform, and it is something your engineers will need to learn. Terraform is extensible by means of a plugin system. HashiCorp themselves maintain the plugins for the major cloud platforms, but there's a ton of other independent ones for managing all aspects of your application stack and anything that can be provisioned through an API, really. The Terraform workflow is shown here at the bottom, and it's a great fit for modern change management practices. The really awesome bit is that you can generate a plan of your changes, and after getting these reviewed or approved, you can apply only that set of changes. And of course, you can see if there's been any subsequent drift since you made the plan and stop if need be. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that Terraform is quite a low-level tool, but there are some ways to make it a bit more user-friendly. HashiCorp themselves have long provided an enterprise version of Terraform. It's basically a web management wrapper around the core tool with a bunch of other big business features thrown in. Unfortunately, the pricing of this is opaque to say the least. It's not listed anywhere, and I've never managed to extract a quote from their sales team. Rumor has it that it's outrageously expensive. So it was a very welcome development when some of those enterprise features made their way into the new HashiCorp Cloud platform, which is a SaaS offering. And that's got a team plan at about $20 a month per user. We're not HashiCorp partners, by the way, so this is all completely independent advice. I think it's well worth a look, though, if you want to soften some of those rough edges around Terraform and make it easier for your teams to adopt. So I'd like to finish up by looking at another practice that I think is essential to formulate a strategy around before you start deploying things to the cloud, and that is resource tagging. So next slide, please. So what are tags? They're a fairly universal concept across cloud platforms. They're a way to add your own data to resources to help identify them later. They take the form of key value pairs. For example, the key might be environment, and the value tells you that this resource is in production. So you might be able to see where this is going to come in useful. GCP have gone with the term labels, by the way, but it's the same idea. So next slide, please. So why is tagging important? The public cloud platforms make it very easy to deploy stuff. It typically takes seconds to bring up a modest application stack, and that makes it very easy to accumulate lots of these resources. Nobody wants to be the person that causes an outage by terminating an instance or running a Terraform destroy command on a stack that might still be in service. So resources do tend to hang around, and they'll cost money even if they're not needed anymore. Optimizing the cost of cloud infrastructure is a hot topic at the moment, and rightly so. Is there any real point in migrating things to the cloud if the total cost of ownership turns out to be prohibitively high? So how do we give an engineer the confidence that something isn't needed anymore and it's safe to delete it? Well, one way is by ensuring everything that can be tagged is tagged with all the information they need to be able to make that decision. Tagging is a really effective way to track where resources come from. So the code repository they're defined in, or what product or stack they belong to, and maybe even who owns or pays for them. Within infrastructure as code plans that show what actions we're about to take, the tags will be clearly visible, helping us to spot that production resource that we're about to nuke. But they're also useful within the code itself to allow us to look up resources that have been created by other modules. Tags are also a really great way to ensure consistency in usage reports for many different parts of the business. So next slide, please. So I'd really recommend deciding on a set of mandatory tags for your resources and enforce these from day one. But do consider all stakeholders when deciding this policy. All technical teams, of course, but also consider finance, InfoSec, or any team with a hand in reporting for that matter. Here's a few ideas on some mandatory tags that you might choose. Of course, we should give teams the freedom to define their own superset of this, to define tags for their own purposes. And it's worth considering dividing the key into separate namespaces for each team or department, each with their own prefix. And that's to avoid collisions when resources are used by more than one team. So in summary, try and form a company-wide policy around mandatory resource tagging and enforce it at every step of the resource lifecycle. So that's when writing code, maybe using pre-commit checks, through deployments using compliance validation steps in your pipeline, and onwards through regular auditing. I think it's really one of the foundations required to keep control of your cloud spend and ensuring that your accounts don't get overgrown, so to speak. So next slide, please. So just to recap, here's a few of the things, and this is by no means comprehensive, that I think you need to consider before taking a leap into the cloud. Think about how your engineering team will learn and adapt, including their personal computing requirements. Review the options for managing your infrastructure using code rather than manually, and tag any resources you create, and be prepared to apply both of these practices from day one. So I hope that was useful. Thank you very much for listening, and now I'll hand you over to Sean.
Thanks, Dan. Hello, everybody. So I'm Sean Walsh. I'm one of the co-founding directors at Perform Partners, with a focus on people and overall delivery capability, including the design, build, and our support option for running the cloud. I'm also a trainee psychotherapist, and I'm in my third year of studying as a student. And I feel this gives me an additional lens on dealing with change with people and organizations and how we all respond to it. So let's get into it. Next slide, please. So we're always changing in life and in business, and sometimes it can feel like it's been done to us rather than for us. Like many others, I've experienced a lot of change throughout my life, which has shaped how I am today and how I behave within my family and business, and how I interact with people and teams. The first picture on there is me joining the army at 17, which probably reset the foundation for everything else that has come after it. The bottom picture there is me getting married, which is particularly important today as it's my 10th wedding anniversary. So I'd have been married about 2 hours this time 10 years ago. So congratulations and thank you to my lovely wife, Aida, who's watching this. In the middle there is renovating a 300-year-old house, which certainly shaped me and probably removed some of the remaining hair off the top of my head. And the most important and ongoing change, frequently the best and the hardest, is having two little boys who are growing up fast and continuing to shape how we interact with them. More of a physical challenge and change. I relearned how to swim so I could take part in a 10-kilometer outdoor swim race. That was interesting, a real journey on how to reprogram some old behavior and habits. And more pertinent to this presentation and business as a whole is setting up Perform Partners just over 3 years ago with Rob and Paul, who you can see at the bottom right there, just after we took part, or just before we took part in the Leeds 10K run. So in this last presentation, we're going to cover a simple group exercise that you'll be invited to take part in. We're going to talk about the experience of working as part of one of the largest cloud transformations in Europe and the interactions with a potentially change-resistant culture and how we overcame it. And finally, we'll pass on some lessons that could help you and your teams deal with change to create happier people and make change stick. Next slide, please. So you are invited to take part in this, but obviously you've got the benefit of not having to talk or see your cameras. But what I'd like you to do is pick up your pen or pencil, move it to your non-dominant hand. So that's the left for me. Write your name in your non-dominant hand. So I'm doing that right now. I'm assuming you are too. And if you're watching this as a recording, please feel free to take part. There's one of my previous attempts on screen, and what I will say is it's neater than my right hand. We won't explore that in this presentation. So what was that experience like for you? As you think about that, you're invited again to put your pen or pencil back in your non-dominant hand and write what you felt during that exercise. Here's a picture of mine in between some of my notes. And while you're doing that, we'll move on to the next slide. So how did that feel? We've done this exercise a number of times, probably for a more interactive audience, and it's interesting to see people respond in person as well. Some of the feedback that we've got is it can feel uncomfortable, strange, slower, awkward, and different. Some people like doing it and they're lucky enough to be ambidextrous, which is pretty much just showing off. So why is that? Why did we feel these things? Next slide, please. So even though the exercise was short and we're using tools such as a pencil, some paper, and our hands that are familiar to us, I believe that some of the feedback and discomfort felt can be attributed to 2 points that have an impact on any change. Number one, we're likely to feel resistance to this change as our minds need to make new connections by building neural pathways which are needed to enable us to operate from our subconscious or without thinking. So if you imagine trying to learn how to drive a car, you do a lot of thinking, probably a lot of anxiety there, but after a period of time, you drive it without, well, hopefully not without thought, but without thinking too much, without panicking if you're going to stall or thinking about checking your mirrors and your indicators. You tend to do it naturally, and that's because you've built the relationship in your mind of how to operate it. It becomes more familiar. Number two, being asked to do something unexpected and outside of the construct of a normal presentation may have increased the anxiety and fear for some people, and then pushed you into a fight or flight mode, which is essentially driven by your amygdala, which is a part of your brain. So this limits the effectiveness of your thinking and your capacity to approach change or tasks with a level head. So you're more driven by emotion when your blood's rushing through your amygdala. Maybe much like some anxiety I've got with doing this presentation now. What I would say is, though, controlled exposure, more proactive communication and repetition, as covered in the first point, to help form new habits, helps to mitigate this, and ultimately change is easier to deal with. Next slide, please. So I'm going to move us from the amygdala and back into the clouds to give us context on how we do our best to take people on change journeys with us when we're working with customers, be it cloud, mergers and acquisitions, or providing good governance support during organizational change. As part of one of the largest cloud transformations in Europe, and certainly one of our largest cloud transformations to date, we helped organize over 200 training courses, which was around 150,000 minutes worth of training. We facilitated hundreds of hands-on labs and 80 game days. So building on the experience of the theory and the training, we wanted to help people use the technology and make it more familiar. So in the previous example of writing, we were encouraging people to keep writing with that dominant hand, so it became more and more familiar. We helped almost 50 people become cloud certified, and that was at all levels in the organization, right from the senior leaders and managers down to new graduates coming in as well. And we championed and facilitated a cloud center of excellence mentoring program to help rotate and build experience for people that had less visibility and capability of the cloud systems in the organization, and mentoring and working with the teams that did. We implemented new ways of working across 10 separate teams throughout the business and introduced feature refinement approach that's still being used a year later. And this calls back to some of the things that Dan and Damo have mentioned around looking at the operating model of the business and seeing where the potential points of frictions are, and building in kind of that design from the start to overcome it. So it's not just the focus on the technology. Next slide, please. So one of the models that we use as a guardrail is actually 80 years old, and it was developed by John Kotter, so Kotter's 8-step model. I like this model because it feels like common sense, it's straightforward, but it provides us with a good indication and steps to help structure change and communication when dealing with customers from the start and to the end. So each area could actually be presented in itself, and it's been iterated and resold and covered in glitter many times. But I'm going to give you a brief overview of what the areas mean to me and how they can be relevant in any change. So number one, establish a sense of urgency. So make the change real and relevant. If people are going to accept change, they need to understand why it's needed and why it's needed now. An example of this could be a data center closing to save millions per year. And it shouldn't be something like everyone's moving to the cloud and we want less people in IT. Number two is build a guiding team. For this, find the people that are bought into the change and are enthusiastic from the start and can get others on board too. People that know how to operate at all levels throughout the company, which is often outside the formal structure. I'm sure you all know the people that know how to get things done in your organization. Go find them, go get them, and get them in your team. Form a vision. So envision what the future could look like if the change took place. Keep it simple as possible and easy to explain, because this will form part of your communications strategy as you get into it. An example of this could be, we are going to build a cloud platform that will help provide access to the world's information in one click. Not, we're going to build a cloud platform so we can close a data center and reduce the number of people we need in IT. Number four, enlist through communication. Tell people about the vision. Tell everyone the change will impact. Keep it simple, encourage questions, and then tell them again. and then keep telling them because people forget. Enable and empower people. Give people the tools they need to get the job done and be successful. Seek and remove those obstacles. Create groups for feedback and collaboration. This could be if people really feel like they need a Mac because their access to the systems is prohibitive, dig underneath that, find out the drivers for it. It could be setting up a feature refinement forum or a community of practice to help bring people together and remove some of those silos that Damo mentioned previous. Keep an eye out for terms like, this is the way we've always done it, and seek to understand what's driving resistance and resolve. Generate and secure short-term wins. The motivational and galvanizing impact of early success is huge. Help people achieve to build confidence and momentum. Number 7 is sustain and consolidate to move forward. So build on these early wins, but keep adapting to the lessons along the way. And finally, number 8, institute and anchor. So once the change is achieved, building time and tasks to weave it into the culture and become normal. Encourage iteration and lay the path for the next change. Next slide, please. So some lessons to take away across any change. Be open, clear and candid when communicating. Keep adapting and problem solving. Don't be afraid to challenge the change yourself. Enjoy the flows of the highs and keep holding on and doing the best you can when the friction hits. Generally, if you're uncomfortable at times and you have a sense of tension, it means you're creating change, and it's rarely easy, but it can be fun. Thank you. So as we invite everybody back on camera now, I think Rob's going to close us out.
Superb. So thank you, Sean. If you didn't get a chance to do that exercise when Sean was taking you through it, I recommend you do it with your team in the office, with your colleagues at home. It's quite unique, and it's super interesting as well. So there you go, folks. As you probably realised, the title "Why You Shouldn't Move to the Cloud" was simply a hook, but hopefully we've managed to surface a number of topics, aspects that we've experienced that you need to consider before you migrate to the cloud. From the very start, misconceptions and considerations that you need to take, Damo's analogy about the cloud is your destination, which I think is a great analogy. I hope you followed along. The technical aspects, obviously that's always front and center, but it's just part of the many spokes that need to be considered. And then finally, the change aspect that Sean eloquently took us through there. So I think we've done pretty well for time. I don't think there's anything more from our side. So as Sean touched on, we're into questions and answers. So John.
Thank you for that, Rob. Yes, and the question panel on your GoToWebinar dashboard is there for you to jot anything down that you'd like to ask the panel. The first question we've got harks back to the Cotter 8-step model, Sean. You spoke about embedding the new change and then make the path ready for the next change. And the question is, do people get tired of change, or do you find, on the other hand, like somebody getting fit again after a period of inactivity, they actually start getting better at doing change? What do you think of that one?
I think, yeah, there's definitely such a thing as change fatigue. I caveat that by saying we're in constant change anyway, whether we're aware of it or not. But this, as an organisation, and we certainly try to do this, it's difficult just to bounce from one project to the next. So maybe part of that is taking time to reflect on the success, you know, the old adage of the lessons learned, but make sure you're building in time to recover as well. Certainly through my early career, you know, for the last 20 years, running projects as a project manager, I've certainly felt the roller coaster of the highs of project implementation, and then, you know, the lows once it's done, and having to rebuild that again as you chuck back up. So, you know, more than ever, I'm hearing more dialogue about looking after people and being tuned into that and giving them time to recover, to reflect, and talking to them about where they are feels very important if you're serious about that sustainable culture and putting the people first. John, I can see your lips moving and I can't hear you.
Well done. I did that old thing of talking while I was on mute. Thank you. We've got a subsidiary question about change, and it's interesting how often IT leaders events like these end up being about human beings and change and management of that process. But here we are. What's the main causes of resistance that you see in people to change, and how do you overcome those causes of resistance? This is one for the whole panel. Rob, what do you think of that?
I think, not to kind of echo or repeat kind of what Sean has just said, it's about communication for me personally, in my experience. What, you know, making sure it's very clear the objectives, the reasons, the benefits of the change. You know, accepting we're all different. It will impact all of us differently, both professionally and potentially personally. You know, we've all we didn't want to kind of bring it into this presentation, but you know, we've all had a very challenging 2 years, personally and professionally. So it's communication, I think, is my simple answer there, John.
Paul, you must have seen a fair bit of change resistance over the years. What do you think?
Is that a good on mute?
Apologise, sorry, fell into that trap. It's about fear of the unknown. I think it always makes you nervous if you don't know. Again, Damien touched on destinations, but if you don't know what the destination is, it promotes anxiety, regardless in personal life or in business life. And it's spotting those signals and those signs where somebody doesn't want to, effectively, you've got a bus moving and somebody doesn't want to jump on it. You need to understand why that is. And going back to what Rob was saying, it is clear communication. We've seen time and time again that actually if people know why they're jumping on that bus, and they know what the reasons are for them and for the business, then it makes life a lot easier to move forward and drive that bus forward as such. But it's clear communication and what the benefits, and effectively you're selling something internally and externally, not just to your business stakeholders, but also to your staff and colleagues that will implement that change.
Yeah, just to reinforce that, I think just coming back to what you're saying there about selling it internally, you know, if you are trying to persuade somebody that something is a good idea, then saying it's going to be good for our customers might not necessarily sell it to them. Whereas if in reality what you're saying is we're going to be taking advantage of the cloud, some of the changes that we can make life more interesting for people who are dealing with applications and infrastructure, and can reduce the amount of the uninteresting work that they have to do. So it is about that sort of not just selling, as you're saying, Paul, not just selling outwards, but selling inwards. Yeah,
we have seen that in the past, where exactly what you said. It's naturally people fear the unknown, fear for the jobs as naturally they would if something like this changes what they do, because they'll be thinking, well, what do I do in the new business, in the new, once the cloud's in? But actually, if you promote, well, you can be part of it, and we'll give you some new skills and new ways to operate. That is received in a much different way than not communicating in that positive way.
from an engineering perspective as well, I think it can feel for engineers in this day and age, we're going through a sort of Cambrian explosion of different technologies, and there's just so much to learn, so much to keep up with that it can feel a bit overwhelming sometimes when you're presented with yet another thing you've got to learn, another change that you've got to learn. But I think you just have to adapt. You have to keep learning as an engineer onwards, and otherwise you are going to get left behind. And it's a sad fact of life, really. But things change, tech changes, and as long as you stay curious, you're good.
Anything you want to add to that, Sean?
I suppose just as a general wrapper, I'd say at the source of any resistance to change, personal, business, if there's anything else, the source of it's fear, which drives anxiety. We've touched on it throughout the various threads, be it the technical or the more human-driven element. What I would say is any technology or any major change, or certainly within the teams that we've seen the biggest resistance to change, it's because those roles help form part of that person's identity and important, and that's always tough. So bringing that into the room, not blaring it out from the outset, but going into it with eyes open and not using a one-size-fits-all or ticking the box that I have communicated. People go up and down. Change goes up and down. Being tuned into it, but keeping the eye on what the outcomes are and why, and being candid and fair, that's important for bringing people on.
Now, we've got a couple of questions around the whole idea of effectively outsourcing your infrastructure. And it touches on something that Paul mentioned at the outset about the whole thing only being effectively as good as the pipeline to it. A question says, do you think that there will be a move back to on-premise if there are more outages from cloud providers? And if you can deal with this one with it as well, as another question that deals with the question of security of that pipeline between you and the cloud providers and the lack of control that organizations have when they have to buy that pipeline, to use that terminology, from a third party. Paul, do you want to touch on that one?
I'm probably better deferring something like that to Damien, but I can't predict. I can't come on the cloud outages and the more outages. I think we touched on this earlier. It's about disaster recovery, like anything. You could have an on-premise data center that catches fire or whichever, but you still need DR in the same way as you would do in that instance. So the mitigation actions in terms of having a solid DR strategy is still relevant, regardless of you're in cloud or not. But in terms of the more technical aspects, I'll probably hand over to Dan and Damien in terms of that answer.
I think the question really focuses. I think the question really focuses at a strategic level over the not so much the DR as your access to it.
So I think it's a very good question, actually, about architecture risks. It's to do with the architecture that you choose to go for. So when I was talking about the portfolio being a mixture of traditional and digital service portfolio, I think this will continue. I don't think that you're going to see organizations doing a full digital approach as it is a high risk approach. It's essentially a way of putting many eggs in different baskets by saying that we're going to have a portfolio that's not just traditional, not just digital, but the digital can be also multi-cloud. So you might not just be going with GCP, the Google Cloud. You might be going with Amazon Web Services as well, as a way of mitigating that risk of an outage. In terms of the connection between the user of an application, or the connections between servers that are in disparate locations, again, I think that's a question about the architecture risk. Dan, what are your thoughts on the sort of like the connections between cloud and sort of like the non-cloud aspects?
Not really sure on that one, but I think just on the point about multi-cloud, I think that's the only real hedge against this kind of issue. It's a lot of work. You know, you've got to put in the legwork up front to operate in a multi-cloud environment. There's no magic infrastructure as code tool that's going to be able to deploy to both Azure and GCP at the same time. You will have to run those two environments. I don't think it's a bad idea to have two environments at the same time, but they're going to be different. You know, the resource model in AWS is very different from that in GCP in certain places. So you kind of got double the architecture work to do as well there.
Yeah, certainly from an application perspective as well, you find that as well, because the web services that are provided, the service platform provided by AWS will differ from Amazon, from Microsoft and from Google. And so from an application perspective, where you are creating applications consuming those platform services, you're essentially having to create an application that can be agnostic as to the specifics of that service. Again, as you're saying, adding in that complexity.
Yeah, it goes from top to bottom of the stack. You know, your network model, the type of instances you're going to run your software on, the actual services that software has access to are going to differ from cloud to cloud as well. So yeah, I think if you find yourself stuck in a cloud you're not happy with, then yeah, absolutely, there are other alternatives out there. But if you really want to hedge against that, I think it's upfront legwork in terms at all levels of the stack that needs to be put in to achieve that.
Okay, thank you. Here's a particularly technical question. Can infrastructure as code be used in deploying applications as well as infrastructure? For example, to deploy containers to a Kubernetes cluster. Who wants to take that one?
Shall I, Damon? Possibly. Yes, I think they can. I consider like the whole stack to be part of your infrastructure, you know, from your load balancers or content delivery network all the way down to your databases, and that includes your application stack. One thing to say about that is that I don't think it's you really shouldn't strive to try and use the same tool for all parts of that stack. You know, when you get, like you mentioned Kubernetes there, you know, let's say you defined your VPC layout with Terraform and your instances, but you stop and maybe you span up an EKS, like managed Kubernetes. Maybe you span up an EKS cluster with Terraform, but then you might find that, like the maturity of Helm, which is another infrastructure as code tool, like I consider it to be that, you might find that to be superior or more appropriate for controlling the application deployments to that cluster. And above that, you might switch back to Terraform for managing the CloudFront setup, maybe. So I think absolutely, it definitely belongs in your in that practice of infrastructure as code, but don't try and shoehorn everything into the, choose the right tool for the job, really.
And there's obviously there are people who haven't yet had anything much to do with cloud migration. And there's a question, if somebody's planning a cloud migration, leaving aside the question of whether they should be or not, what basic initial capabilities do they need in order to do that successfly? Rob, do you want to take that one? Damien.
So when I was talking about capabilities earlier, I highlighted what I considered three of the key areas: the project delivery, the platform operations, and essentially the developers. Those are the three main capabilities, depending upon whether you are migrating a built application, an application that you have built yourself, or whether you are migrating an application that you've bought. And it's interesting because if you then look at the wider set of capabilities, then you can also start talking about business analysis. It's inevitable that business processes may change as a consequence of migrating to cloud because of the way in which certain things are done, whether that's to do with ITIL processes or to do with line of business processes. Things will change, and the coordination of what that will mean to roles, to processes, to the way in which people interact with systems, and how data is dealt with, how is it managed, how it's stored, how it's curated. That business process, that business analysis capability is invaluable. From personal perspective, as an architect, when I'm getting engaged in a project, if I see a project manager and a business analyst involved with an infrastructure expert, I am confident that the capability is in the right direction. When I start on a project which doesn't have those capabilities, particularly project delivery, whether it's a product owner or project manager, that central core that says this is the person providing the rallying call, it can risk the success of the delivery, essentially. Paul, what other capabilities would you say?
Yeah, to add to that, it needs, so for organisational change, this is what we're talking about, organisational transformation, it needs a strong core governance wrapped around that, because you have multiple stakeholders across your whole organisation that need to be managed. As Damien mentioned, the importance of the analysis piece across the board to make sure that, again, your destination target operating model fits, it will be fit for purpose and is well understood, not just communicated, but understood. That's the clear bit. If you got that bit right at the start, then it's planned correctly, and people should never underestimate how difficult, especially a large organizational change like that. If it is a complex organization, it needs a strong core team to manage that through and negotiate effectively with stakeholders with potentially different wants and needs throughout the businesses in terms of what that cloud offering would be for them. Yes, it's a complex thing, but it just requires really strong governance in the middle.
Just to put kind of a wrap around that as well, our experience of starting migrations with big customers, it's been built on collaboration with AWS professional services. So, the teams that built it, fundamentally, the Amazon guys that built it. So when we look and work with customers now, we essentially do a migration readiness assessment, looking at the drivers for change, the person and team capability in an organization, the technical capability in an organization, and broadly, to put it simple, where they want to go, where they are now, where the company is now, technically and people-wise, and then we help close that gap. And that could be a number of weeks, a number of months, years, sometimes dependent on the size of it. But it's about understanding where you are, where you want to go, driving it effectively.
On that subject, we have a question: which cloud migration, in your experience, is the most straightforward, and which is the least? For example, AWS, Azure, SAP, Oracle, and so forth. And how much does it depend on what you're migrating from? For example, homegrown or one of the IT providers. Sean, do you want to pick that up?
No, no, but I'll get a start. It'll give Damien and Dan more time to think. It's as complex as the information you've got. What we do find, what drives complexity is the amount of technical debt, fundamentally, and how much does a customer, how much does a company understand what they've got now and how they're going to move it. And really that comes back into the drivers for changing it. So what have we got, why we're changing it, and then getting the information that naturally propagates in somebody's head that's been there for a number of years, that's likely not written down in a wiki, not on a Confluence page, not on a pretty architecture diagram, but really getting into it and having the instincts to feed that information out, because that shapes your approach, that helps you mitigate the risk of things going wrong down the line. We also mitigate that by choosing essentially non-critical applications for the start, so we can learn quickly. But as far as the technology goes, hopefully I've provided enough fill. So let me have a look. Damo's smiling, so I'm going to pass this one to him.
It's a good question about the differences between the different cloud providers, and depending upon what you're looking for. So coming back to what is it you're migrating? Are you migrating from an existing, you mentioned SAP, for example, there. if you're migrating from an on-prem SAP to a new ERP, then that has a different set of characteristics to if you were migrating an application that you've built into Amazon Web Services versus Microsoft Azure, depending upon the way in which the existing technology works, the way in which your intended architecture, larger architecture, not just about a particular application, affects that decision. So it really is about what is it you're migrating and what kind of risks need to be addressed as part of that.
I think part of that as well, Damien, just sparked in me an idea, and Dan, I think I'm going to come to you this next, is what you intend to do as part of the migration. Is it changing state? Is it just going from here to here, or are you changing the shape of it? Are you refactoring it, or what are you doing with it? And that goes back into understanding right at the start what outcomes we're working towards here, and plugging on Damo's analogy of the train station, at which point are we on the journey? Dan, I think I cut in then on you.
No, it's all right. I was going to go back to a point you made anyway about tech debt, and that's crucial. If you're cleaning up, if you're hoping to clean up a load of tech debt when you're doing this migration, then of course it's going to be more difficult. I don't think any of the major cloud providers or platforms are better than another one. I think if you looked at a particular application you were trying to, an off-the-shelf application maybe, and you found that vendor had a preference for AWS, you might follow the crowd. But it goes down to what you're trying to do as part of the migration. If you're trying to roll in some cleanup and some cleanup of the tech debt as you go, it depends on the complexity of your estate. If you've got a tangled web of 200 different services, it's going to take a long time to unpick and work out which ones can move and which ones are latency sensitive, etc. And then, also just the size of the estate as well. How much stuff are you trying to move? If you're an enterprise, then you're clearly going to be a more difficult task than moving a simple web server. So, yeah, I think it really does depend on your environment.
Okay, thank you. And that brings us to the end of the questions that we've been asked. So thank you to all our speakers for what has been a fascinating and deeply thought-provoking session. There's a great deal for us all to take away from the presentations. We'll share the recording in the next day or two. And if you think of further questions, please do email them in and we'll do our best to address them for you. In the meantime, when you close this session, and again in an hour's time by email, you'll be invited to complete a survey. Do please give us your views by that survey. It's incredibly helpful to understand how you rate these sessions. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you found it useful. Thank you for attending. Thank you again to our speakers, Paul and Rob, Sean, Dan and Damien, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.